Mara pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the van, trying to steady her breathing as the kidnappers argued loudly over directions, their voices bouncing around the cramped interior. Like broken glass, she kept her eyes half closed, pretending to be too terrified to notice anything, but in reality, every second she scanned her surroundings, committing details to memory. She noticed the faint scent of gasoline mixed with old fast food, the way the driver kept tapping the steering wheel like he was impatient or scared, and the nervous glance the man in the passenger seat kept giving the rear view mirror, as if he expected someone to appear on the road behind them. Mara leaned slightly to the side, pretending to shift uncomfortably so she could peek through the grimy back window, and she saw the narrow gravel road winding behind them, lined with tall pine trees that created a shadowy tunnel of green. She spotted a long scrape on the van's exterior, likely from brushing past branches, meaning the kidnappers were taking an off-road path, one that locals knew well but outsiders rarely used. The perfect kind of road for bikers to patrol, she told herself silently, and hoped the iron talons might cross paths with this route. If her fallen keychain had been found, the kidnappers suddenly quieted when the driver spotted a fork in the road ahead and turned sharply, making Mara slide a few inches across the metal floor. The man in the passenger seat snapped at her to sit still, but his voice shook slightly, betraying uncertainty. She realized then that these men were desperate, not seasoned criminals, and that fear made them unpredictable, but it also made them sloppy. She shifted her legs subtly, sweeping the loose floor mat with her foot until she felt the corner lift just enough to glimpse the rusty bolts underneath. One of them looked loose, maybe loose enough to remove with enough pressure. She debated whether she had time to use it as distraction later and tucked the idea away. As the van rattled over another pothole, Mara felt something small roll against her ankle. She looked down and saw a metal washer likely fallen from the van's rattling interior, and she slowly nudged it closer to the sliding door. Each tiny object could become a tool, she reminded herself. Every small movement needed to count. She allowed her breathing to grow louder, pretending to cry softly to keep the kidnappers' attention away from her legs and her quiet adjustments. The passenger exhaled, annoyed, and told her to shut up, giving her the opening she needed to nudge the washer toward the tiny gap where the doorframe met the floor. If they hit another bump, it might fall through, leaving yet another trace. Moments later, the van jerked violently as it rolled over a thick tree root, and the entire frame shook. Mara quickly pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself, watching quietly as the washer popped out and fell onto the gravel below. Her heart fluttered with a spark of hope, because each clue increased her chances of rescue. Then she heard it, the faint but unmistakable rumble of engines in the far distance. She lifted her head slightly, pretending to adjust her hair, but really she was listening, focusing every ounce of attention. The engines rose and fell like a low growl echoing between the trees. The kidnappers heard something too, because the driver glanced back with wide eyes before telling the other man to get the rope ready. Mara swallowed hard but did not panic. She knew if she panicked she would lose the clarity she had fought to maintain since the moment she was grabbed, so she steadied her breathing again and replayed everything. She had seen the chipped latch, the cracked handle, the torn mat, the two men who could not stop arguing, all details that formed a map of what she might do next. The van slowed its speed as the road narrowed into a path barely wide enough for the vehicle, and she saw sunlight flicker through gaps in the trees, creating brief flashes of gold inside the dim interior. The passenger finally opened the rope, and Mara pretended to shrink back, as if afraid of it, but her mind was elsewhere, following the sound of the engines she heard earlier. Meanwhile, far behind them, the iron talons had split into two small groups, searching the roads that branched across the woods. Hawk, still clutching the keychain in his vest pocket, urged his riders forward, scanning every curve in the gravel for signs of skidding tire tracks. He had a sinking feeling that every second mattered, and he could not shake the memory of Mara waving to them weeks ago. As they passed by her family home back in the van, the kidnappers were growing more frantic. The passenger kept checking his phone, complaining that the signal was weak and he could not reach whoever they had planned to meet. Mara realized that the remote location was working against them too. Giving her more time for rescue, she angled her foot under the floor mat, again feeling for that loose bolt, and pressed hard, hoping it would dislodge as the van shook over another bumpy patch. With a soft clink, the bolt rolled free. She silently thanked every small stroke of luck and palmed the bolt, quickly hiding it under her leg. The van emerged from the dense trees into a clearing where an abandoned lumber yard sat silent and overgrown, and Mara felt the shift in the air. The engines she heard were louder now, closer, and before the kidnappers could notice her reaction, she looked down again, pretending to cry while she braced herself for whatever might come next, convinced that help was racing toward her through the whispering pines just out of sight. The lumber yard lay silent. under the sinking sun, its long shadows stretching across piles of timber and rusted machinery, as Mara crouched behind the forklift clutching the chain she had pried loose. She listened to the kidnappers shuffling around trying to locate her there, footsteps crunching on gravel while their voices rose with anger and uncertainty. One of them shouted that she could not have gone far, and the other muttered that they needed to hurry. Before anyone followed them, Mara kept perfectly still, her breath shallow, as she tried to map the yard in her mind, remembering the layout from the quick glimpse she had taken before she slipped away. She knew there were stacked pallets to her left and a long metal storage shed behind the forklift, and if she could reach that shed, she might find something else to use or even a place to hide. But another thought stayed lodged in her mind. The engines she had heard were growing louder, and she needed to position herself where the bikers would see her first. The kidnappers argued again, one insisting that they drag her out fast, and the other saying they should move the van to block the entrance to the yard, so no one could drive in. They were panicking more by the minute, and Mara sensed that the balance of control was shifting as fear took hold of them. She slid the chain quietly along the ground, its heavy links rattling just under her breath, and looped part of it around the forklift frame, creating a makeshift anchor. Then she pulled one end across a narrow gap in the path, hoping the kidnappers might trip or hesitate long enough for her to escape. She knew it was a small chance, but anything that slowed them mattered. Just as she tightened her grip on the chain, the deep growl of engines finally rolled into the clearing like thunder shaking loose dust from the rafters of the old shed. The kidnappers froze, turning toward the sound, their eyes widening as the iron talons roared into view, forming a line of bikes across the entrance, their headlights cutting sharp beams through the dusty air. Mara saw Hawk at the front, his jaw set and his posture rigid as he scanned the yard, searching for her before he even acknowledged the kidnappers. The sight of him filled her with a sudden wave of relief so strong she almost stepped out too soon, but she held her position, remembering Hawk's warning gestures on the roads he had drilled into the local kids about staying low during trouble. One of the kidnappers shouted at the bikers to leave, while waving the metal bar he had picked up earlier, but his voice cracked and his hands trembled, revealing how overwhelmed he was. Bikers dismounted, their boots thudding heavily as they approached in calm, steady steps, the kidnappers' backs pressed against the rusty machinery while fear flickered across their faces. Mara knew this was the moment to move. She let the chain drop and dashed out from behind the forklift, heading straight toward Hawk, who raised his hand, signaling her to stay behind him. The kidnappers noticed her movement, and one lunged forward, but tripped on the chain she had stretched across the path, falling hard against the dirt and letting out a hoarse cry. The second kidnapper tried to scramble toward the van, but one of the bikers intercepted him, blocking his path and forcing him to back away. With shaking hands, Mara reached Hawk, and he quickly ushered her behind him, forming a solid shield of leather and steel as the other iron talons closed in, securing the area with practiced efficiency, their engines still rumbling like distant storms. The kidnappers, now cornered and outnumbered, dropped their makeshift weapons and held up trembling hands as they realized there was no escape. Mara watched with wide eyes as the bikers kept them contained until the authorities arrived, alerted by Hawk's earlier call on the road. The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the clearing, blending with the fading roar of the bikes. When the police finally took the kidnappers into custody, Mara felt the adrenaline begin to ebb, leaving her legs shaky and her chest tight. Hawk knelt in front of her, asking gently if she was hurt, and she shook her head, though her voice would not yet form words. The other bikers stood nearby, keeping a respectful distance, but their protective presence surrounded her like a wall. As the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the trees, Mara stepped closer to Hawk and thanked, her voice